Hey, nice to be here. I hear my mic is on. Good, awesome. Right, how many of you have heard of YesML before? Oh God, there's like one guy. He's lying. Have you heard of ReasonML? Yeah. This talk has nothing to do with ReasonML. Have you heard of Yas? This Yas. You've heard of this, right? Yeah, this talk has nothing to do with that either. So this is a talk about a very exciting topic that we all want to hear more about after like one good talk and a break. It's about yet another React state management library. What? Another one? You serious? Like who in their right mind in 2018 would write a React state management library? Well, I'll explain everything in a little bit. My name is Jani. I work at Formidable Labs. That is my Twitter handle. If you like shitposting, then that's probably a good idea to follow it. If you do not like it, then you probably should not. And today, I mainly work on React, React Native, GraphQL, Node kind of stuff. I've been writing software for a little bit. And at Formidable, basically our goal is just to assemble the best minds in the kind of JavaScript community to work together on exciting projects. That's what we do. But like all good JavaScript and React developers, we have this one weak point. We have this kryptonite that we just can't let go. Is that we love writing React state management libraries. This is like it's almost like a rite of passage for every smart person, to do this. So this talk is not about this library. It's Reactl. It's written by Dale Bostad, who works at Formidable. There's also Phil, this guy here. He wrote a state management library for React. It's called Florine. It's pretty great. It's also unmaintained, so I probably shouldn't use it. Blaine, who also works at Formidable, wrote this thing called Coflux. It has 11 stars. I've never heard of it before. You probably should not be using that one. And then this guy, Ken Wheeler, who wrote this thing called McFly. It was actually pretty interesting, but it's like 2 years old, and all the ideas have now been done a lot better. But yeah, so if you look out in the world, outside of Formidable, there's a lot more of these. Gant Laborde, a guy very kind of influential in the React Native community, just started this project called the React State Museum, which is basically where you just put all the state management libraries that people can come up with. You just document them there. The museum word, I guess, should be indicative of these things being, like old. But not all of them are. And they just started. They only now have like about 10, but you could easily add like 30 more in here because they do exist out there. So thankfully, I have never, to this date, written one, and I'm not here to talk about one that I've written. I'm more of an ideas kind of guy. I think, like this was one of my big ideas, is like write a React state management library on top of Ethereum, because what we want is like consistency and reproducibility. Redux tells us these things, right? But it was really good. Like I made a prototype, but it's like each state change takes like 2 days and it costs $10. So it's like, all right, not maybe a good idea. Anyway, so why would we possibly want another state management library? Didn't we all agree that Redux is a good solution? Well, there's all these, people on the internet, like if you go on Twitter, there's all kinds of assholes there just saying things like Redux is dead, like we shouldn't be using it anymore. But actually, there are some really good reasons why maybe, like that one really good tool that we have isn't a great tool for every possible problem. It's about well-acknowledged, well-trodden topic. Dan Abramov, the creator of Redux, wrote about this in 2016, which in like tech years is about 1975 or something. And we know this, like it's not, like Redux is, everybody here knows Redux, right? Good, yeah. So it's basically like a really, really handy tool for a number of things. But you might not need it. It can be overkill for some things. It has really good use cases. I don't expect you to read all of these. It's just a bunch of text. But basically, there are like a lot of cases in which this is a really great tool for you to make your programs more predictable and like have a good time writing and maintaining them. For me, one very interesting thing about Redux overall is that like it's a very useful idea when you think about it, not necessarily as a library or like a framework for you to write your own code that operate on state, but like an inter-op layer for other people to write code that can operate on that state. So if you think about your Redux app, you have your debugger tools, you have your your side effect libraries, you might have a persistence in there, and it's really great that we have this kind of like a single standard on which we can sort of build abstractions. As an example, because I was feeling a bit inferior because I've never written a React state management library, I did write this thing called Redux Offline, and this talk is not about this, but it's an idea of like you can take essentially your entire app that works as it does, and you can relatively easily make it offline first or offline capable by just adding and enhancer to your Redux store. And these are like really great qualities in software development. But so the thing is, like we have this great freaking thing. Why can't we just keep using it? Like, yeah, we can. Okay, Dan, you might not need Redux, cool, but can I still use it? And for one, I'm really tired of this bike shedding, of us like rewriting our apps like every year of the new hottest tool. But at the same time, I'm also really, really tired of writing Redux reducers and like touching 7 files every time I need to flip one bit. Because sometimes it's simply not necessary. And I think there's a category of applications in which all this weight, all this cost actually outweighs the benefit that you're getting out of it. And that's what I really want to be talking about today. And the other thing is that if you're kind of like you're saying, all right, well, let's stop innovating. Let's not create anything new. Let's just like we have found a good tool. It looks like a rock. We can use it. To bang things at. This is perfectly good. We can keep using it. But with that way, if you look at the annoying part from going today, you have a good tool and then you innovate and then you need to learn new things. That's annoying. But if you take a little bit longer term view, you look at 5 years out, 10 years out, if we stop doing things, we're going to be exactly where we are today. If we do new things, then we're actually going to get pretty far together. So what I'm saying is like what I'm about to tell you now, just keep an open mind to it. And let's see what kind of trouble we can get into. So fine. I am open to the idea that I might not want to use Redux for everything, but what then? We just had an amazing presentation about MobX and MobX State Tree. I think these are really, really good tools. I think there are some things that they do better than Redux does. There's some things that they are maybe not as suitable for. I think it's all about trade-offs and finding the right tool for you. But in my opinion, if the problem is solving the overkill, solving the you might not need it problem, then what we need to do is we need to do even less. We need to, for specific category problems, which we'll get to soon, all these existing tools that we've had in the past have, a bit of an overhead. So the question is, what is the minimum amount of work that we can, do, or what is the minimum amount of effort that we can get away with, while still getting, the benefits that are actually suitable for the kind of applications that we are writing at any given time. So this is a story of 2 libraries separated at birth. One of them is called Unstated. Has anybody here heard of Unstated? We have quite a few hands up. People are very timid. They put finger up like this. So Unstated is a library by James Kyle, who is fun on the internet. And the pitch for Unstated is that it's state's so simple that it goes without saying. The simplicity is baked into the marketing message of itself. What that in practice really looks like is that it looks very much like React components. If the idea is you as a developer, you go read the React docs, and you know how to use set state, then basically you should be able to use Unstated with very, very low mental overhead. And here in this piece of code, the idea is that you create this container component that looks very much like a React component, but doesn't render anything. It has a state, and you can set state on it. But when you use this familiar API, it's really cool because you can actually initially write your code in set state in components, which some people call an anti-pattern, but I think it's probably a really good solution for a category of problems. But then you get 2 new problems. It's you can't share that state with multiple components because it's baked in one, and also it gets a little bit harder to test when it's you're actually testing for render output. So Unstated is basically just a way of saying that, okay, copy paste your code that you had in your set state methods before, lift it up to this container, and then you can use it like this. Rather simple. There's a fair bit of code here, and I'm not going to go through every bit of it. But the idea here is that you have this subscribe method that you can import from Unstated, and you can pass your containers, 1 or more of them, to it. And then there's a render prop or a functional child prop. This is basically it's a fancy React way of saying that you just declare an inline function as the immediate child of it, and that receives the state of those components. And that not only gets the state, but it also all the methods that you declare on the container. You have them over there, and you can use them to mutate your state. I actually kind of like this. I think it's a very elegant abstraction to a problem that has often been over complicated. The only tiny little thing you need is that you need to put a provider on top of your application somewhere. This is exactly what you would do with your React Redux application. You just drop a provider in there. No biggie. I haven't personally actually used Unstated for anything. I'm just here talking about things I know absolutely nothing about. But there's some testimonials. These are from the website of Unstated. Sindre Serhus says that it's a breath of fresh air. That's great. There's those other ones that says, when people say you don't need Redux most of the time, they actually mean you do need Unstated. It's like set state on fucking horse steroids. This is a quote from my colleague. Anyway, so there's other library. This one is called React Copywrite. And don't, if you didn't get everything, don't worry. Maybe these libraries aren't the point of the talk. Maybe there's like a realization at the end of this. So React Copywrite is another library. This is written by a former team member of mine, Brandon Dale. He currently works on the React core team at Facebook. And it's this library that has a very, very different take to marketing than Unstated does. Unstated states so simple, it goes without saying. React Copywrite, an immutable React state management library with a simple mutable API, memorized selectors, and structural sharing. Pretty, it's a mouthful. And it's like, okay, how is this simple? Like, how is this actually like solving anything? We have all this kind of complexity to it. So let's just turn to the code really briefly, look at what that looks like, and then talk a little bit about what it actually does. So React Copywrite doesn't actually look that different from what we just saw in Unstated. It has like a little bit different, more like a functional style approach in that you create this, like state entity, and then you drop a provider on top of the app. This is exactly the same as you would do with Unstated. And then the consumer code is basically, it also looks rather similar. So you declare this consumer, that gets a render prop, the state gets passed into it, and then within there you can access any state. Now this obviously, if you are used to React programming, you can already see some things that are kind of bad here. Like for one, that if you're observing some kind of a state and you're just importing the whole state, then the whole component will re-render. So that might be problematic. It's also like you're coupling your component into the structure of your entire state tree. This component needs to know exactly where things come from. So that's why React Copywrite has this idea of selectors, which is basically, you might have used this in Reselect or whatever. Even actually in your Redux app dispatcher props, you probably use this. The idea is you have a function that picks some pieces of the state. Now, pretty simple. These selectors are memoized, they're performant, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't really care. What's kind of interesting about, or what's very interesting about React Copywrite is the idea of how it approaches updating state. So if you look at this piece of code that is highlighted currently on the screen, I don't know, like this rubs me really the wrong way. It's like you're literally, it has the word mutate, and we've been told that you should not mutate state, and then you just go and you literally mutate that state in there. Like, you go it's like making a crime while yelling like, oh, I'm doing a crime. It's like it's pretty brazen behavior. But the exciting thing about this is the way it works, because internally it uses other library called Immer. And this event has been sponsored by Michel Verstraete, the creator of MobX State Tree, and also a creator of Immer. And he is apparently hot shit. So it's this library that has this very simple idea of like what we actually want is our programming to look mutable. Mutable APIs are really easy for us to understand. But we actually don't want those performance characteristics. Like we don't want to mutate objects because it's harder for them to track, so it's hard for React to be performant. And it's also, maybe it gets us into hairy states of incomplete mutations and whatnot. So the way Immer solves this problem is that it creates a copy for you. So when we are in this previous piece of code, we're calling mutate and we're giving it a function that takes in a state. You're not actually getting a state. You're getting an empty proxy, and then that proxy records every mutation to it. And then when that function, exits its scope, it's over. Then Immer just takes that draft state and then copies those, creates a new version of your state with those mutations applied, which is pretty cool. And so this is how you use it on its own. You can basically use it with anything. Here we're just using with set_state because it's just the function that produces a function. So you can use it with set_state, you can use it with Redux, whatever. And if you're not convinced that this way of programming is easier to understand, I think if you do Redux programming or whatever, you see this spread hell this idea of like you're hell bent on creating immutable objects. You don't necessarily want to use something like immutable.js because of the the overhead and a number of things. But you end up programming like this, and this is just not easy for humans to read or understand, whereas the topmost one is. So if you take something out of this talk, other than what I'm intending to talk about, is to look at Immer as a library, as a general purpose programming utility for Redux, for React, for really like anything. It's not in any way dependent on a React specific thing. But which one should you use? Should you use unstated? Should you use React copyright? One interesting metric is how much are people using this? Unstated is relatively new, but it has it has 5,000 weekly downloads, pretty cool. React copyright has 41 weekly downloads, which basically means that Brandon Dale runs npm install 41 times in a week. So it's not what you might call a battle-tested, mature library. There's also like some differences around it. One of them is like extremely simple, and it's meant to just be low overhead, really easy to learn. The other one is actually trying to do the right things and do it in a way that might be more complex in like a mental model, but like produces simple code, via Immer and via that like simple API. And using them doesn't really look that different. I mean, if you look at these pieces of code, I mean, what? Like it's the same thing. Like you use a provider and an app and subscribe and consumer. Like it's the exact same thing. Like is there no originality anymore? Like it's like who wore it best? Who's copying who? I mean, like a guy called Brandon takes something from a guy called Jamie. Like that's like Beverly Hills 90210. Like it's I don't know. There's something really really weird about this. And in reality, of course, neither of them stole anything from the other. They look very similar because they share a common ancestor, and probably most of you have already caught on to what this talk is really about, which is React context. Can I have like a show of hands, not like a little finger, but actual show of hands, like how many people here know what React context is? All right, that's cool. So I'm sure most of you have at least heard about it. Some of you have even used it, but I'm going to really briefly explain what it is and then tell you why I'm talking about it today and why I think this is a very exciting topic for the season. So in React, I literally just made this slide like 3 minutes ago. I copied that from Google image search tree, copied it in there. It's beautiful. So one of the kind of like the strongest like points, the things that is absolutely the best about like React-like component-based programming is that components are just functions that take in props and then they render children. It makes it incredibly easy for us to kind of like think about programs to reason about them. And this is like a really fantastically sort of simple but blunt instrument. And where you see the bluntness is like sometimes you need to be able to communicate between components in a way that isn't necessarily a parent-child relationship. A very common thing about this is like, well, what if you need to hook up to your Redux store? What if you have a theme? What if you have internationalization? Something that isn't like, you can't just like pass one thing on top and then flow that down your application, because that would be incredible amounts of code, but also it would be incredible amounts of coupling between every part of for your app. And so React context has always existed. It's been there since 0.4 or something. It's a very old thing. But it recently got overhauled in a way that makes it actually usable. So I don't know if you can see this code. It's not really important what the code is. I just really wanted to use this meme, and this was the best way of doing it. So React used to have this concept of context. Any component could declare a getChildContext method and declare the types that it's going to return. And then any other component like rendered underneath it could just read from that context in order to kind of read information ancestrally like this. The problem with that always was that the first implementation it wasn't very clever. It turns out that even smart people don't always do the right thing at first. It takes a bit of iteration to do that. And there was one massive problem, which a lot of you know, which was that the context values did not actually pass through should component updates. So at any point, if somebody wrote a should component update method in your tree that didn't take context into account, didn't know about it, then your app would basically break. It wouldn't update anything downwards. And that's why libraries like styled components, it went through whole lengths of creating custom event emitters and whatever, and it was just a mess. So it used to say in React docs that this is an advanced feature intended for library authors. You should not use it in your code. I've multiple times rejected pull requests because somebody in app level code tried to use context. It's just not a good tool. Didn't work at all. But now in React 16.3, we have this new context API that you've already seen, actually. I've already seen it to you 2 times in this talk. Once in the case of unstated and once in the case of React copyright. But I'm going to really briefly go through the API, and then let's talk about what this thing is actually good for. So in React right now, you have this thing called React.createContext, and you just call that method to create this kind of context entity. You give it some initial state. It's interesting that from React 16.3, you can actually import this from React. You don't need any libraries. You don't need any shims. So it's kind of like baked in. And then in your component, you can just create a provider. So this is like the top level thing that essentially says every component that will be rendered under this subtree will be able to read from this particular provider. And then you can use very simple things like this.setState, as we can see here, to set that value, and that value will then propagate down to any consumer that is listening below it, which is great because there's no overhead. Like if you there's this whole concept of like a library overhead versus like framework overhead, and React has always been such a minimalistic framework. You can read the docs in like a couple of hours. And this is just one chapter in the docs now. It becomes part of the React curriculum, which means that it becomes part of the canon. Everybody will know how to use it. Everybody knows how to understand. So there's no kind of, you're not taking on team technical debt by like introducing another library. And then the consumer side, we've seen this already in both of the libraries that we looked at. So you basically define a consumer that takes in a child render prop, and then it can do anything it wants with that data. So that to me is these 2 pieces of code. They look very innocuous, but there is actually a lot going on. What you're essentially doing is that you're creating this interdimensional portal between one part of the application and another, and then you can pop open like the end portals anywhere. You could like basically travel data somewhere, and you can kind of see that this might not be a great solution for everything. Like some of the things that we love about React being props and props in and components or elements out is like it kind of challenges some of this. But there are some like generally useful use cases that I think we're gonna in the the next year or so we're gonna start changing like how we approach some of these problems in our React code, and I think it would be really useful to be aware of how this tool works in these contexts so that you can make the best of it. So very simple things. Theming. If you use styled components, for example, or if you use some library, you already have the concept of a theme. That thing just propagates down the context. Great things can happen. You can have different parts of the application with a different theme. You can change a theme. Let's say that you have a dark mode in your app, or you have a user preference that you can change the color on it. If you just define a global, how do you actually make sure that your entire application reactively updates? Before context, you had to use a library that supported this explicitly, but now you can literally just pass a value down to context. You don't need a library for that. You can just say set state dark equals true or dark equals false, and then any UI element that needs to know about that particular theming can just read from that context and reactively update when that changes. Same thing with internationalization. If you want to change the language of your app on the fly, this is not so much maybe a use case for web apps, but in like native apps, I've seen this quite a bit. There's like a language selector, and you can't just F5. You can't just like refresh the whole page. Like you need to actually have a way of reactively rendering your app from scratch. Very useful. User preferences, session data. Like if you have a login data that needs to flow down the app, and like these last 2 things probably should have been their own slide, but like these are the 2 big ones. Lifting state up and the idea of like intergenerational communication. I'll go through those one by one, and then I think we're close to understanding what I find is to be so cool about context. So lifting state up has always been the motto of React. What makes React work so well is the idea that you can take any component and you can essentially make it presentational. You can make it dumb. You can make it incredibly simple to implement, to change, to replace, to delete, to test, because you can always just take that state and you can move it up one level. So you can essentially make any component a controlled component. But the idea here is that you can essentially use context for a lifting state up that needs to basically flow down your entire application without having a library at all. And the other thing is about intergenerational communication. My colleague was recently writing a feature for an application, and it's like there's this one tiny little thing that like you need to essentially like render a thing outside its parent and not really like where it is. And then in order to do that, you would have to basically, if you're using Redux, you would have to write like 70, 100 lines of code to like you make a Redux action and like you do all this kind of crap. And you're not really managing state. You just want to make sure that you can pass with a piece of data from one part of the application to another. So this idea of intergenerational communication is very interesting, because when you start looking at state management, you don't actually have to use your state management solution to all the things that you've been using it for before. You can actually use it for state management, which means that context isn't necessarily a replacement for Redux. It's a tool that just actually like makes your code simpler. You can keep using Redux or Mobex State Tree or whatever, and then you can use these simpler tools that are built and baked in for the thing that they are actually good for. And I'm going to go back a little bit just to like illustrate the point, is that these components themselves, where I'm using a provider and a consumer inside a component, these don't need to be in your own code. You can essentially make those into higher order components or make those into render prop components, which means that like you're not actually coupling your code into the entire structure of the context. You can simply like write abstractions for it in a way that makes sense for your app or for your domain. So you don't need like a one size fits all solution. You can just improvise when needed. And I think that's the kind of exciting part for me here, is that so many times we start with like a rigid tooling or a structure in mind that may very well serve our needs. And like Redux is a really flexible tool, or Mobex is a really flexible tool. So you can actually make them do anything, but you so often you don't know what your requirements are going to be up front. And especially if you work in a product organization where you're like tending a code base garden for a very long time, you take on these dependencies and then they become like this thing that you just like keep dragging on where you might not even need them. Because sometimes it's better to do the other way, like under engineer first, and then when you discover a solution, you are a programmer, you have the power to refactor, to change things. So only like adopt tools and methodologies when they become needed. And now React has like that one little extra layer on top of it, which is just more powerful, which like allows you to go further without using like third-party tools. But everything is always, there's always a downside. It's like you shouldn't use context for everything. Like if you don't need it, like it does introduce complexity, it does introduce like coupling. It does take away like some of the simplicity of your React rendering hierarchy. So it's not like a panacea. What I'm saying here is like it's a great tool for things like cross-cutting concerns, like the ones that we've been talking about, but it's not something that you should use to implement like logic and functionality when it's not needed. So yet another state management library. Do we actually need one? I mean, you might not need yet another state management library. You might actually be able to get really far, especially in simpler applications that are not like these huge kind of enterprise monoliths, but are like simpler apps that you are writing for your own benefit, or as like a smaller side project, or it's a component that you're putting somewhere else. You might not need a library for it all, but it might be a good idea anyway. Because I know, right? Because like some of these libraries that we looked at today, Unstated or React Copyright, what they're doing is like if you look at the implementation, especially Unstated is a glaring like a fantastic example of this. It's so tiny, like there's nothing to it. It's essentially just saying that, hey, I like this context that we have. It works great, but I just want to make a slightly different API for it. And essentially React Copyright does the same thing. It just has a little bit more like fancy terminology and like libraries around it, Immer. But it's essentially like it's somebody's idea of like taking a primitive and making it like suit their needs. So what I would say is that you might not need it yet in a state management library. It might be a good idea, or it might be a good idea for you to essentially like look at your application needs and write the level of abstraction on top of it that you need. And I think that's that's kind of cool. Oh God, what is that? So I'm gonna just leave you with resources. I never do this because I like to make people think that I'm a smart one, but I've actually just referenced other people's work here, so I probably should. So the React context docs, my favorite thing about it is not how it works, what the API looks like, it's the fact that the documentation is amazing and it's in the React website, so it's not like a Medium blog that's going to get outdated. And React Copyright is a library that has currently 41 weekly installations. You could be the 42nd. I'm not sure. So Brandon will be speaking in React Europe this week and the next week. And his idea is that he wants to get back to this library and develop it. So probably it's going to change a lot in the future. But there's some really clever ideas around it that are good to take on, especially Immer on its own is fantastic. Unstated, I don't know. Like, I haven't used it. I heard it's like set state on fucking horse steroids. So that's pretty good. And yeah, that has been me. 30 minutes sharp. My name is Jani. I am on Twitter, and I work at Formidable Labs. And even though we didn't pay for the beers, we're still hiring. So thank you. Thank you.